morning, everyone, and welcome to our discussion forum today. So what we're going to be talking about today is access to the collections and to the data and to images. And we had a webinar, sure, it must be, maybe it's 3 weeks ago now, where we looked in quite a lot of detail at policy and what does open access mean and why access is so important, and about workflows and documenting these. So today really the focus is about implementing access requirements in the manual. So it's a big chapter in the manual. It may be very daunting for people. And so what we're going to focus on is, so what do you need to do to meet the standards that are set in the manual? And then we'll open it up for discussion about some of the questions or challenges about access to collections. So it is one of the sort of tricky areas of work when you're managing a collection is dealing with access. So what we said last time, and just to emphasize again, that providing access to the collections is one of the main tasks of staff who manage or care for collections, and one of the main functions of the institutions that have collections. So if you have a collection and its purpose is research, then it is critical to make it accessible to others, to researchers in your institution, but also outside the institution, because that is how it increases its value. If it's not being worked on, it has very little value. So that's why it's really important. But dealing with access properly can take a lot of staff time. It doesn't take a lot of budget usually, but it takes a lot of time. So it's the way that the investment of the collection is justified. So you have to invest the time, because that's the way you get your investment from government or whoever funds that collection, especially if it's a state collection. So funding and posts. If you can show high use of your collection, you can justify investment in it. So I showed this slide in the webinar, but just to show again, this is data that Chanel has coordinated from all the participating institutions. And it just shows how much these collections and institutions have been used for research over the last 5 years. So, 1,000 visitors a year using the collections. That's nationally nearly 1,000 overall in 5 years. International, lots of data requests, lots of records provided, lots of material going out on loan, lots of tissue or DNA samples supplied, and then coming out from that, a lot of papers that have been published, over 1,000, and a lot of new species described. So this shows the levels of use. So I think we're doing well on that side. So you might think, well, what's the issue? There's lots of use. What do we need to deal with? And what we need to deal with is to professionalize and to meet sort of accounting standards. And I know most of us are biologists and we hate accounting and accounting practice. But if you have policies and procedures and standards documented, this really helps staff to make difficult decisions about providing access. So it's not always easy to decide whether you send a loan or you give somebody 2 samples or you hand over data. But if you've got your policies, it really is helpful. If you've got your policies, it ensures that there's fairness, that everybody is treated according to the same criteria, and everything is transparent, and you can't be accused of bias or acting unfairly. And having these documents also protects the collections from risks associated with access and use. The more they use, the more, if you've got all implement them, then you can avoid that risk. And then it also helps know what to do and how to do it. So often old, experienced staff know what to do and they leave, and someone new comes in and they don't know what to do. So if you've got everything documented, it helps. And then it's becoming more and more important to have all your policies, your procedures, your standards documented. And that's for audits by GRAP. GRAP 103, that's the Auditor General's Office that comes. And it also is important for reporting for annual reports. So if you're doing everything properly, you can easily pull out figures that you need for your reports. So there's a whole lot of reasons why having these documents is so critical. So implementation of the manual, I think that there's always a lot of questions. So what does it mean to implement the manual? What does it mean to meet the standards set? If you look at the manual, at the chapter on access, there's a lot of information there. And there's lots of guidelines about policy, procedure, standards. There's templates for the forms for different aspects of access. And so that can be very daunting. How do we even start to address the requirements in the manual? So the issue is, like I've been saying, it's all about having the documents. It's impossible to manage access properly without having everything documented. So you need a policy, you need procedures or workflows, and you need standards. And it's worth investing the time in developing the documents, because that will help you save time going forward. So instead of having to scramble around every time you get a request, deciding what to do, how to do it, who's going to do what, how to package, how to post, how to do everything. If you've got everything documented, you actually end up saving time. So it's a worthwhile investment. So the big thing, the first step is really to have your policy. So to have a general policy on access. And we did talk about this in the webinar. So there are guidelines for your policy in the manual, but just to recognize that what it says in the manual as guidelines might not be relevant if you run or you manage a teaching collection like Rendani from UKZN. That's really a collection that's been established for teaching, and you might have a different policy for that. Keisha at Skukuza, that's a reference collection. You might have a different access policy for that because it's got a different purpose. Some private collections, you might have a different policy on access. So it's not universal, but for all state-funded research collections, those guidelines in the manual should be applicable. So it really is about saying that you provide open access in a fair and transparent way, that there's processes, that it must be legally compliant, that there must be records kept of everything, and that you follow the procedures that have been established. So the policy can really be very short, 1 to 2 pages, and just state these high-level policy statements. First thing to do. And then it's the standard. So we talked a bit about this in the webinar. So when you start to drill down into the actual specifics, this is where it becomes a bit more tricky. And this is where you need your annexure to your policy or a separate document. So you need a standards document for visitors. What are the rules about visitors? So not what are the rules that visitors must follow. That's a different thing. But who qualifies as a visitor for research? Do they have to be at a formal research institution or not? Can postgraduate students come? Can undergraduate students come? Who qualifies? What information must the visitor provide when requesting access? So you can refer to a form that they must fill in, but you need to set the basic standards for what a visitor must tell you before they come. Who makes the decision about whether a visitor can be given access? So who says yes, they can come, or no, they can't come? And then who signs off on that? And then this is your rules for visitors. What can they do? What must they do? What can't they do? What mustn't they do? So that's your visitor guidelines to give to them. What will they be provided with? So this is the standard. What is the basic standard of what you're going to provide them as an institution, a visitor, a desk, a chair, a light, a microscope. What is the expectation of visitors? So what do you expect of them? They must comply with your rules for visitors, that they must sign in, that they must notify you, so they must meet a certain level of expectation from you. What is the expectation from staff dealing with visitors? So what do we expect from a staff member who has to deal with visitors? They must meet them on arrival. They must ensure that they're available for the visitors to call or contact when they need something. You know, so those are kind of your standards. And then what documents must be provided to visitors? So there will be a certain set of documents. What must visitors sign? So they're going to sign the visitors register when they come in. They're going to sign the rules that you give them. And then what will happen if a visitor does not adhere to the guidelines? So this is your standards that will help you and guide you for dealing with visitors. It's a 2 to 4 page document. It's not procedures. It's not the step-by-step process. It's standards. It's what can they expect? What can you expect? And you can refer to procedures. Then there's a separate document. What are the standards or your rules for loans? So there's probably a lot of this in existing loan agreements. And I think most institutions do have an existing loan agreement. But there will be other parts that are not in existing loan agreements. So who can get a loan? Who will you send material to on a loan? Who can't get material on a loan? Then you need to also in your standards document say who assesses the request, and then who authorizes and approves the request. And then we talked a bit about this in the webinar, but how many specimens can be sent on loan at a time, which ones can be sent, which ones can't, what proportion of a particular species specimens can be sent on loan, what documents must accompany a loan, and how long are they made for, how long is a loan normally made for, 6 months, 3 months, what extensions do you allow, what's the maximum period, what can people do with material on loan, what can't they do to specimens, what needs special permission, and then what postage system do you use for sending or returning or ask them to return the loan by. What are the legal requirements for sending loans? Who signs off on returned loans? And then is there a decontamination of returned material? And then your tracking of loans and documentation. So that's all in your standards document. It's again another 2 to 4 page document, and it will refer to the detailed workflows or procedures documents. So which ones must be followed in dealing with loans? So you can see there's a policy, there's standards, and then the how-to is a different matter. Okay, then for data and images. So this, I think, is less well established in institutions than loans are. So loans are a tradition that goes back, 100 years, but data is more recent. And so I don't know, some institutions might have standards for providing data and for providing images. But again, what information must they provide? So when they request, what do you want to know from them? Do you want to know what they're going to do with the data? Do you want to know where they're from? Do you want to know what their track record is, or is that not important? Who can ask for data? So will you provide to anybody? Will you provide to consultants, to only researchers, to students, to members of the public? Who? And with data, maybe it's much more open than sending a loan. And then what criteria are used to make a decision about providing data or images? So how do you decide whether you're going to say yes or no? And who reviews the requests and makes the decision, and who authorizes it? And what data can be provided and what data can't be provided. So is there any data sets, any particular species, any particular fields that are not provided that needs to go into your standards document? And then are there any restrictions on how much data can be provided to service a request? So can somebody ask for your entire database or only a percentage of it, or what? And then what can the requester do with the data? So can they pass it on to another person? Can they publish it to GBIF? What can they do? What can't they do with it? And then what do you expect from them? So do you expect them to acknowledge your institution? Do you expect co-authorship if it's a particular proportion of the data? What are your standards? What is expected of the staff or the institution in servicing requests for data or images? How fast should you respond? You know, how do you deliver the data? What format will it be provided in? How will you get it to them? Will you email it, use WeTransfer, Dropbox, send them a USB or an external hard drive? What is your standard for supplying data or images? And then how do you record the number of data requests and images that are requested and supplied? And then what about open access through GBIF or institutional website or other open access platforms? So what's the standard for that? So your policy would probably say that your data should be openly accessible with only sensitive data restricted. And then your standard would say, we will publish data once they're cleaned. We'll be publishing them to GBIF, or we'll be putting them on our institutional website, or we'll be putting them somewhere else. So this, again, it's a 1 to 3 page document that addresses these specific standards questions. So this is also perhaps a little bit newer in our practice. I don't know how many institutions have got standards for supplying tissue samples or DNA extracts, or for doing destructive sampling of specimens, so removing some tissue or material from them. And this is not a loan, it's a different process to a loan, because it's a donation, so it's destructive. It's consumptive. You don't get your whole thing back again once somebody's looked at it. So it might be a little bit more tricky. So again, what information must requesters provide? Do you need to know if they've got a lab where they're going to process this? You need to know if they've got enough budget to allow them to do sequencing or DNA extraction. And then who can request tissue samples or DNA extracts? Would you allow commercial use, or is it only for academic use? What criteria are used to make decisions? So you've got to be careful that it's not a process of checking the quality of research proposals and using that as a block to prevent use. And then, yeah, who makes the decisions, who authorizes, and then which samples or specimens can be provided. So there might be some that a researcher in your institution is working on, and you might not release those for 3 years. So what is what can be used, what can't be provided? And then again, what documents must accompany the material? So there should always be a material transfer agreement. When you transfer, you're not loaning, you're transferring material to someone. And then again, what's expected of the requester? What's expected of the staff or institution supplying the material? What are the legal requirements? And then what postage system do you use for sending the material? It's might be a little bit different to your loans. So that again would be a 2 to 4 page document. So those would be your standards documents, and then you're going to have your procedures or workflows, and there'll be a lot of these. Not all of them will be relevant to every single collection or to every single institution. But you should have workflows, step-by-step how-to documents, and who's responsible for each step, and your time frame. So how long should each step take? So there should be a workflow or procedure for access requests, decision-making, and approvals. And we looked at that one in the webinar. There should be a workflow procedure for receiving visitors, for giving them some kind of an induction and health and safety talk, and attending to their needs and documenting them. So there's a whole lot of steps when you get a visitor. And then there should be a workflow for loan requests for the decision-making, which could be, it could be integrated with the next one, number 4, loan requests, selecting material, documenting, and approvals, but it might be better to keep them separate. So these are complicated, multi-step processes often, and so it needs to be documented. Packaging, postage, documenting, what are all the steps in that? Or loans that are coming back, returning loans, what are all the steps for that? Data requests, approvals, extraction of data, supply of data, documenting request and supply. Then your image requests, there may be 2 different workflows. So you might get somebody who requests images that you don't have yet. And so you've got to go and actually take the photos or scan a particular specimen. So that might be one workflow, and another workflow if the images already exist. Then destructive sampling. So how do you take the sample? How do you remove tissue from specimens? And then if you're supplying DNA extracted tissue samples, how do you check their quality? How do you provide data with them? How do you package them? How do you post? So these are the how-to, and each one would probably be 1 to 2 pages. So they can be short, and you can either have a table with each step and a responsible person and a time frame, or you can have workflow diagrams that we showed last week. So there's probably at least 10 different workflows that you need related to access. And then you also need to check that you've got your forms, all the correct forms, so an access request form. You could have different ones for different types of access, but it might be simpler to just have one access request form, and there is an example in the manual. There should be a visitor agreement, so the list of rules for visitors to follow, and they sign off on that. There should be a loan agreement or loan form, and I think most institutions have that already. There should be a specimen movement slip. So when you take specimens out of the collection to go on loan, you put that specimen movement slip into where you've taken them from, and you say where they've gone and what date and when they're due back. And when you return them, you take that slip away. There should be a data or image sharing agreement, and that will give you the conditions of images, and there should be a material agreement. So these are forms, like standard forms that you will have. Register or a list of all the access requests. There should be a visitor book, and I think most institutions do have a visitor book. But it must be clear whether the visitors are there to research or they're just see friends, so that you get a very clear picture of. Sorry about that. We're having a big electric storm, and I think it just hit the satellite connection. So yeah, apologies again for that. So we're talking about the registers, so the register of access requests, a visitor book, a loan register that can be electronic. Samples supplied, again, it can be electronic or it can be a hard copy register. So all the tissue samples, DNA extracts, a list of all the data supplied, and then also tissue DNA extracts supplied. So there must be a register. So if anybody asks you, how many loans did you send out? How many specimens went? How many data requests have you serviced? How many records were distributed, you can answer that question quickly. You don't have to run around checking. And it just means you've always got that record of everything that's going on. So those registers are very important. And they are the kind of things that auditors would look at. Okay, so that is really the core part of implementing the manual when it comes to access. You can't change the way you did things in the past, but you can deal with the documents. So it's worth sitting down. If it takes a week, you sit down and you just get all those documents done. And then once you've got those documents, you review your existing processes. So how does your packaging for a loan work at the moment? Is there anything that's being skipped in your workflow document? What needs to change in the way you do things, the way decisions are made? So you'll identify gaps, then you've got to inform relevant staff about what needs to happen. So if things are going to be different, well, how are they going to be different and who needs to know about that? Check whether any training is needed and organize any training that is necessary. So maybe the staff don't know how to do proper packaging, labeling, putting the documentation on the package. Maybe they can go to another institution and learn. And then check for backlogs. So do you have any requests that have not been responded to? So quite often when there's a difficult request, it will get pushed aside and left because you don't know how to respond to it. The loan tracking. So when last did you do loan reminders? Send them out, call loans back, check that that's all happening according to your standards. And then have you got any returned loans that haven't been processed yet, fully checked, signed off, documented and integrated back into the collection? So that often happens in institutions where people are really busy. The loan comes back in a box, you have a quick look and you put it aside. And it doesn't go back. So those are just to meet the requirements in the manual. These are just things that you have to go back and do. Okay, so that is actually the easy part. So it might sound daunting, but really getting those documents done isn't very difficult. And doing your checks isn't very difficult. The difficult parts are where there's things that we just don't know the answers to. So this question, and it comes up every time we talk about anything permits and loans, what permits are needed to send out a loan? And we don't know the answer completely. So we do know that with threatened or protected species, so the TOPS legislation, the receiving institution must be registered as a research institution with the Department of Environment, so DFFE. Or they must have a permit to possess that material, even if it's just on loan and it's temporary. So you need to know which species are on the TOPS list and are any of those being sent. And for every institution who holds those species, you must be registered with DFFE. Then you have to also check whether anything on that you're sending out is CITES listed. If you're sending out a bit of rhino tissue, then the receiving institution also has to be CITES registered. And you have to use labels on the package, and you may have to also get a permit. If you're sending ordinary material, so let's just say it's not CITES, it's not top species, it's just an ordinary packet of rat skins, do you need a permit to send it overseas on loan? I don't know. It's unclear. I don't think so. If it's all coming back, I don't think you need one, but it's not clear. And then obviously if you're sending type specimens, and I think all fossils, I stand to be corrected, but I think it's all fossils. If you're sending them overseas, you also need the Heritage Resource Agency, SARA. You need a permit from them. So if you're sending out a holotype of anything, if you're sending out an isotype, paratype, any type material, you have to apply to SARA for a permit because they're seen as our heritage. And then the Section 20 for the control of animal disease, those I'm not sure whether you need to get that permit if you're sending out a loan for preserved animal specimens. And it's a pity Lee's not here because she would know. But if you're sending out bird skins or rat skins or bones or pinned insects, do you need a Section 20 permit if it's going on loan? And then what permits are needed to supply tissue and DNA extracts? All the above will apply. But you have to have an export permit for everything that you send overseas that's not coming back. So you're giving them our genetic resources. And so that needs permission to do that. So you have to get a permit. It says in the legislation that it must come from the province, but it's not clear if it's the province where you base or the provinces where that material was collected. And if you've got material that's collected from 10 different, or can't be 10 provinces, 9 provinces, do you have to get a permit from each one of them? So that's still not very clear. You have to have that material transfer agreement. It's not a permit, but it's an agreement. It's a formal contract. And then if you're sending out animal tissues or DNA, then you should have Section 20 permits. But I'm not sure about the requirements for preservatives. So if you're sending out something in 100% ethanol, do you need to get a Section 20? I don't know about that. Sometimes they might, this falls under the Department of Agriculture, and they might want to come and check your institution. And they might want to know where's that material going to, and they might require certification, registration through their process. So it's messy, you know, and so it's not as simple as just packaging alone and sending it. You have to check all of these different things. And then when you look internationally, I'm not sure about different countries' requirements for biosecurity. So you have to check very carefully. We do know the story about Australia destroying a package of herbarium specimens that were coming from Paris, and they didn't have a biosecurity clearance certificate with them, and they incinerated them, they destroyed them. So I don't know where we find that information. You'd have to try and check. And yeah, what are the requirements? Bones and skins and pinned insects can carry pests into countries. And so they have a right to be careful and cautious about it. But I don't know of institutions that fumigate packages before they send them. Lee is here. Great. So, yeah, so these are lots of uncertainties. It's not as easy as just documenting a workflow or setting your standards. It's figuring out, because of the diversity of legislation and the diversity of types of specimens and the diversity of things that we do with these specimens. So those are the difficult parts. Okay, I think I am almost done. Oh yeah, postage. So there's also questions about, will courier companies take ethanol specimens? You know, I think you do have to get all the ethanol out of them and then pack them in moist. There's some standard for how much you can have in a package. But what about specimens that might not be able, you can't do it with? So very soft tissued samples, specimens. Do courier companies take any biological material? So will they courier skins and bones and fossils? Does the post office still work as a reliable postal service? I don't know. And can you carry specimens in your hand luggage when you're flying? So I've often been tempted to do that. But could you get caught when you check in your, when you go through? So pinned insects, I know of people who've been stopped because they've picked up all the pins when they put their bag through, and those were dangerous objects, and so they weren't allowed to take them. They make you say whether you've got any flammable substances on you, so ethanol is flammable. Can you check in, put them in your check-in luggage when you travel by air? There's all these kind of, I don't know, it's not so clear. Okay, and we'll get some more input on this in a minute. And then you can think about what are other difficult questions that you might have about access. So a lot of you will have experiences. Some of you will have experience dating back many years. What are some of the questions? And maybe others in the group can help you answer those questions. So that's all from me. I just want to show the assignment before we close. I actually have to go to another meeting. But for assignment 13, there's going to be 2 options, and people who are not doing the course but are working on implementing the manual can look at option 2 as a good thing to do. So review existing documents in your institution for access, and then look at what's needed in the manual, according to the manual, and see where the gaps are, and draw up a kind of a table, a register of what you've got, what you need, and you can then start working on them. Everybody's going to have to do some workflows for some things. So for the assignment, there's an option to pick any 2 processes and do 2 workflows related to access. Can be for visitors, loans, data, images, tissue, DNA. All right, so let's go back a slide, and I'm going to ask Fulu to facilitate questions from anybody and input. And I'm sure Lee will be able to give us a lot of guidance and input. So she will have sent material. High biosafety risk species to be sent in DNA RNA shield. Yeah, and then we got to, how do they check? Do they check that? You know? Okay, and then we can, I think you can take down the presentation, and then we can see whether anybody's got any answers or any questions or any comments. Okay, Fulu, I'll leave you to deal with this. Right. Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody, and apologies for my bad connection. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.